Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I am your host, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of a gorgeous book that is the second in a series. It stands alone on its own, but it is a companion book to another really gorgeous book. And I am so excited to talk to its author. So please welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Anita Kopacz, and the book that I am talking about today is called The Wind on Her Tongue. It is the second book in my Daughter of Three Waters trilogy. The first one was Shallow Waters, and I'm excited to be here to talk about them.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these books with me. Before we talk about them specifically, I'd love to talk a little bit about your career and your journey to these books. When did you get interested in writing and how did it lead to this project?
So I've always been a storyteller. Like I've always loved it ever since I was younger. But I was more into math and science, like in school and in college. I went to UC Berkeley. I did civil engineering, right? I was in the math and science, STEM, all that stuff. And my senior year, my counselor brought me in. This is at Berkeley, and they're like, "You are not going to graduate if you don't take freshman English." I was like, oh, okay, I'll take it. And I ended up falling in love, like falling in love. And there were so many reasons why I kind of tried to avoid uh, any reading, writing, English classes. I am dyslexic. And so I just thought I wouldn't be able to do it, right? Like there was just this feeling of inadequacy, I would say. And finally, like once I really like dove in, I found so many different ways to kind of move around it. Obviously, when I was younger, I had to the I would say like the rules of the English language and spelling and those type of things. For some reason, my brain just can't get it, right? And I've tried. I've I've been trying for a long time. And but I was able to move through without it. Like I always had straight A's. So the teachers didn't necessarily know it. What what helped me with that was just memorization. Like I had to memorize everything. There was no sounding out things. I was just like, I have to memorize this. And so I think that it brought me into this place of actually a strength because um, you would think, I would be a civil engineer or a doctor or a scientist, right? No, I did not do that. I decided to do what I was really not good at because I had such a passion for it. And so that was kind of how I moved in. So ironically, I was the editor-in-chief of a national magazine for 5 years, right? So it's so interesting how you can end up doing what you had such a challenging time doing as a young person. And so I always tell people to stay open to that because sometimes it's like I feel like it's the universe telling you, actually, this is what you're going to be doing.
That is so interesting. And I totally agree. I think it's a really great example of how, something that you view as perhaps your greatest weakness can actually end up being like a really amazing strength. And that's really beautiful.
That just gave me chills.
Yeah.
Love that. It's true.
Mm. So let's talk about your books a little bit. This is a companion volume to Shallow Waters. I'm curious, before we talk about Shallow Waters itself, how did you approach writing a book that could be or can be read alone, but also is a companion to another book, is a part of another series. How do you, appeal to the readers you already have and also draw in new readers?
So, what was really interesting when I wrote Shallow Waters, which was my first novel, when I finished it, I was done. I was like, I'm done. The story is done. And people kept saying, oh no, it's a part of a trilogy. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's like, I'm done with the story. I'm moving on. And I sometimes feel like when I'm writing, the characters harass me, right? Like they like wake me up in the middle of the night and they tell me things, right? Like what's going to be in the book. And I mean, that sounds a lot more ominous than what it feels like just now. Not that bad. It's really actually pretty cool. And so when that started happening, um, I was like, oh my gosh, it is a part of a trilogy because the characters kept coming and they're like, so the way that it works in to be a standalone piece was that Shallow Waters is about Yemeya, who is a Nigerian goddess, so to speak, an Orisha, and from the Ifa practice in Nigeria. And she is the goddess of the ocean. And her daughter is Oya, who is the goddess of the storm and weather. And so they're standalone pieces because this one is about Oya. It takes place 18 years later, right? Like it's a different time and place. But what I love is that while you can read it standalone, if you have read Shallow Waters, it's fun to see all the little nuggets and be like, oh, this is what, Yemeya was talking about. And it's just, it's cool. Like you have two different experiences, obviously.
Hmm. Yeah, and I imagine it would be really neat, like if you've read Shallow Waters to then go into this book. But also if you encounter The Wind on Her Tongue first, it would be really interesting to go back and read the first one and see, where all those threads came from. So I really like that sort of, like a choose your own adventure a little bit, like between books.
Oh my gosh. Those were my favorite.
Yes,
Those
me
were my favorite as a child. Oh my God. I was obsessed.
So good. So if we could talk a little bit more about Yemaya, because I really love your approach of placing a deity in American history. I'm curious about like how you chose the historical figures and the events that you wanted to explore, and perhaps how you use her to provide a new perspective on those aspects of American history.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. So for me, one of the things that came up when I first wrote Shallow Waters was I originally wanted it to be YA, which my publishers don't always like me to say that, but
We won't tell anyone.
I know, right? And the reason I wanted it was because I did want another perspective and way of sharing about our history, our American history, those times that were really intense. And I remember when I first learned about slavery in school when I was younger, and all of a sudden, even if it wasn't meant to be right in the class, I just felt automatically less than. I was like, oh, like, just took it completely personally because I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, they're better than me, right? Like this whole thing went on. And so I was like, well, I want to find a way to teach that time while empowering, young people to just feel like, oh, they can do something about this, right? Because while this is history, we're always going through different iterations of these type of things because we haven't yet healed, right, from all of this history. So there's like just different iterations of the same things. And so I wanted to empower them, right? And bring in this perspective of a deity, right? Like, oh, but then she's coming into human form and everything is new, including racism, right? and how she kind of like looks at it like, what is this? Right? Like, um, so that was one of the reasons why I did it in that way. But when the publishers read it, they were like, oh, adults need to read this. I was like, I agree. But to me, I love YA books. So I was like, I read YA. And they're like,
Absolutely.
no, no, no. We're going to have it be adults. I was like, okay.
That is so interesting. And, I think you're absolutely right about the way that history has been traditionally taught in this country, I think, especially. We talk about history itself, like the content of it can be traumatizing, but also like the way it is taught can be traumatizing too. And I think it's a very Eurocentric view to be like, let's teach this without any attentiveness to trauma or, like the emotional impact that this stuff is going to have. And so I love the way that you use her to provide another perspective to, explore really difficult material, but in a way, as you said, that is empowering rather than like destructive or damaging.
Exactly. Yes. You just like, I want to give you a mic so that you can drop it.
Oh, yeah, it's such a really interesting thing. And you do see that too in The Wind on Her Tongue. This time you see it through Oya's perspective, the deity of weather, as you said. I'm super interested in how you use like the let's say like this isn't quite it, but like the symbolism of nature, because in the first book, there's the themes of water and healing and motherhood. And in this book, it's connected but different, like we're talking about weather and emotions and mastering those things. So can you talk a little bit about like how you use maybe like the powers of these deities that to also tell your story, if that makes sense?
It completely makes sense. And the way you said the symbolism of nature, because these deities, I know a lot of times, for lack of a better word, I say gods and goddesses, the pantheon of gods and goddesses, but they're actually like spirits of nature. And so it's the spirit of the ocean is Yemaya, the spirit of the wind and storms, right? Is I was going to say Oshun, which is going to be the next one, but is Oya. And so with Oya, it's interesting because not only is she the spirit of these things, the wind and the storm, then it's so awesome to bring in the theme of that throughout the book, right? Because it comes up in so many different ways. And even how I say the wind on her tongue, that's it's coming out of us, right? Like our breath it's on our tongue. That those are the words. And so I've forgotten the question. Did I answer it?
You did, yeah. I was,
I did. Okay.
I was thinking a lot about, how, yeah, how their powers sort of feed into like the themes of the story. And I think that Oya's relationship to the weather is a really good, almost like a parallel or an avatar of like her inner emotional turmoil too, so could you talk also a little bit about like grafting a coming of age story onto these ideas? Because she's at a different phase of her, I mean, they're deities, but her life, as it were.
Yes. Yeah. And so I do love, I've always loved coming of age stories. And I feel like it's really that moment of trying to figure out who we are. And to me, that journey is, even if we're looking at a young person trying to figure out who they are, I think that as long as we're here on this earth, that we go through cycles of trying to figure out who we are, because who I am today was completely different to who I was 30, was completely different to who I was at 18, completely different to who I was at 7, right? So these stories are so powerful for so many different age groups, right? And but as she has her coming of age and trying to figure out her powers, and that to me is reflective of us just figuring out who we are. Not we're not necessarily like creating storms and using those type of powers, right? But we step into our own power when we figure out who we are, what we love, what do we really truly want to do when we wake up in the morning, right? Instead of like what we're forced to do, right? And so those moments I think are really important for the character. And with Oya in particular, I don't want to give away the story, but she is dealing with a lot of trauma. And so when you were saying, you know, the storms are reflective of what's happening inside of her, right? She's having to heal a lot of trauma. And one of the things for me that I wanted to work within this was mental health. And so we see that she's kind of declining in her mental health. And so her finding herself has to do with with kind of getting a hold of what's going on in her mind as well. So mind, body, and soul. And what I think is really awesome is that she's always guided. There's always a woman there to help her. And so there's like the sisterhood aspect and just knowing that she's not alone.
That is something that I really loved about the book, and it's something I actually wrote in my notes that these are stories that are about like inner resilience and about like using your own resources, but also about the collective, right? And how you get those resources through connection and through relying on other people and having them rely on you. And I think that like leads into another question I have, which is, both books are full of things that are like not just heartbreaking, but traumatizing for the people who are experiencing them. And yet they're both still like, I think, ultimately hopeful books. How do you balance that? How do you balance like this sort of open-eyed, realistic view of our history with this sort of a sort of optimism or a hope for the future?
Ooh, I don't know why that just made me emotional, but it just to me it felt like that's how I live life, right? Because we look at everything that's happening in the world and it's like, oh my gosh, well, how do we get out of bed, right? And for me, when the story of Shallow Water, so my first novel came through, and the story was coming to me, and I was like, I really don't love reading or watching things about slavery in early America because I usually feel pretty intense, broken, mad, all these things that come up. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to write about it, I have to go through the whole motion so that when someone is done reading this, they don't they don't feel broken, right? Like
Mhm.
I wanted people to feel hopeful, like you said. And I think what does that is the community. Because while all these things did happen, what Mr. Rogers said is always find the helper, right? There's always a helper. No matter how hard things have been, there's always people there that are going to be helping. And so I think that's what I wanted to show was the community, this tight-knit community that is having its own experience while all of this craziness is happening in the world.
Wow, that's so beautiful. And it's like a really good reminder, I think, that hope is like not just sort of, something that you decide to have or not have, but it is I was going to say a weapon, but a tool. It is something that it is another tool in the toolbox of working through this material and creating a better future. So I think there's something really lovely about that too. I'd love to go back for 1 second to ideas of coming of age, especially in relation to the historical period that you have chosen. This is not something that I thought about before, but as you were talking just before, I thought about how interesting it is that Oya is coming of age after something traumatizing and the country kind of was too. So could you talk a little bit about, yeah, the
Yes.
history that you explore in this volume?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually, so where the book begins, it begins in New Orleans. And I actually went to New Orleans to study Marie Laveau, which is one of the characters one of the historical figures that was in it. In pop culture, she is represented in so many different ways that are not reflective of who she was as a person. She has a big presence, a magical presence, right? But when I went to New Orleans and I learned about her from I would say like from the people who do the tours, from looking at books and things like that. So people who actually knew her, she was this benevolent presence that was healing. Like that was the main thing, is that people felt like she was healing. She stood up for people. She would meet with prisoners and pretty much give them hope, give them their last rights. Not only was she a voodoo queen, she was also a, a, in Catholicism. So she did both religions. And and so there's such a mix. It's very hard to do research on Marie Laveau because there's so many things that aren't necessarily true. So it's like, I kind of had to pick and choose, basically. And so what was really interesting about that, as far as our country coming of age, I asked one of the people down there, I was like, well, it's so interesting to see, all of these African American historical figures that were really well off in New Orleans. Like what was that, when so much, like the rest of the country was like, there was slavery, like it wasn't good for African Americans in other places. And so what they had told me was that before the Louisiana Purchase, so before it was purchased, um, the way that the French would, um, I guess, their approach to slavery was that on Sundays, the enslaved Africans could sell their goods. They could work for money, right? So they could raise money on Sundays. So dang near everyone bought their freedom, right? So they just would work and then they would buy their freedom. And so there were so many free Africans in New Orleans. And so by the time the US bought it, they tried to, implement their ideas of slavery in the space, but it just never really like took. All those people who were free, they were just like, like, no, this is not, we're not going to do that. And if it felt like there was too much force, they would go out into the swamps and live as maroons, right? As free Black people in the swamps. They figured out how to do that. And so I didn't know that part of history, but it was like, oh, you're seeing kind of like the coming of age of how did our country come to be, and why is New Orleans history so different from everywhere else, right? Especially in the South.
Oh, absolutely. God, it is such fascinating history. And I've always really loved stories about Marie Laveau. And I think it was such a really cool depiction of her here that you see on the page. Another favorite historical figure of mine is Mary Ellen Pleasant. And she also appears, I hope that's okay to talk about too.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So could you talk a little bit about like what was your like your research or your encounter with her like?
Yes, absolutely. So she was actually the first historical figure that I came upon when I looked up famous Black women in the 1870s, because when I figured out when the book would take place, I was like, okay, so I know it's somewhere in the 1870s. Let me see, who were the people that were kind of moving and shaking and doing things. And so for some reason, I had never heard of Mary Ellen Pleasant. And like when I was almost ashamed. I'm like, this woman is amazing. She's done so many things. How have I never heard about her? And so she was the first person that I like I said that I when I looked up who these characters might be able to be. And so as I was reading, I saw that she studied under Marie Laveau. And so I knew who Marie Laveau was, right? I was like, oh my gosh, this is coming together, right? Like I was like, yes. And so um that's kind of how she came into play. So what's really awesome about Mary Ellen Pleasant is for many of us, we learned that Madam C.J. Walker was the first self-made woman millionaire, not just Black woman, just woman millionaire in the US. In reality, it was Mary Ellen Pleasant.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how come they don't teach that? And I think because she was a voodoo queen, she also was a madam. They probably didn't want to explain that
Yeah.
to kids, right? Um, and but all of the other things, you know, she was into real estate. She was one of the co-founders of Bank of California, which I believe turned into Wells Fargo. And one of the really interesting things I learned, her partner, Thomas Bell, who wasn't her well, we don't think was her romantic partner. I mean, there's always things that are they're kind of leaning towards that, but her business partner, Thomas Bell, who was a white man, he pretty much like was able to kind of guard her money while he was alive, right? Like because that it was right after slavery, it was pretty hard for a a black woman to like rise in it by herself. She had to pretend that she was the help. And
Mm.
so when people would come to her 30-room mansion, she would pretend that she was the help, serve them food. And while she was serving them food, they would be talking about their investments in silver, gold, and things like that. So then she would take that information and do her inside trading, right? Before inside trading was illegal. And and so that's how I mean, like if you look up like how much money, like the equivalent of how much money, it's something crazy like 30 billion. Like it's something, it's so much. And unfortunately, they didn't set it up in a way so when Thomas Bell died, all of Mary Ellen Pleasant's money went to Thomas Bell's family, wife. And so it was kind of a sad ending to the story because she wasn't able to really like get it back again. And but it still is just quite remarkable what
Mhm.
she did during this time.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating history, and I think that is one of the great gifts of these books is that it does, I think in a very entertaining but also educational way open up the doors to like this history that doesn't get covered when you're in school. And I think it's a great not to get on my little like soapbox, but I think it's a really great demonstration of why it's like important to learn about history throughout your life. It's really it changes the way that you move through the world, and it gives you tools and resources that you don't have if you don't know what's come before. So thank you for giving us these books and for coming here to talk about them. This has been absolutely lovely.
It's been so amazing. I love your questions. And I mean, if we weren't on a podcast right now, I'd say you need your own podcast.
Thank you so much. And I hope maybe you'll consider coming back when the third book about ocean is out. I would love to talk again. So
Absolutely. I would love it.
okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out The Wind on Her Tongue and Shallow Waters while you're at it. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So please head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to get your books. Okay, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.